Good morning. I'm John Hindmarch. I'm part of the 3D imaging group at UCL, which is part of the civil engineering department. I'm currently studying for an engineering doctorate in the use of 3D imaging by cultural heritage institutions, primarily in public-facing applications, so as opposed to archival and curatorial purposes. And as part of that research, I cover everything from scanning individual objects up until scanning entire museums and galleries. So this is at one end of the spectrum of the thing I do. I mean, generally it tends to be the smaller objects, but so this is not my normal area, but hopefully you'll think it's an interesting project. So the shipping gallery, I'll tell you a bit about the space that we scanned. It's the largest single gallery in the Science Museum. It's a huge space. I think you can get some impression. This is about a third of the space you can see here. So it's a huge gallery. It was opened in 1963, so it was also the oldest exhibition, or was the oldest exhibition in the Science Museum, and largely unchanged since 1963. So it was in itself, it's almost a museum exhibit. Contains about 100 of these amazing model ships, a lot of machinery and technology from the history of sailing, and dioramas showing history of vessels around the world, and model ships carved out of ivory by prisoners of war in the 18th century. So it was an incredible gallery with an incredible variety of objects, but as I say, it's untouched since 1963, and very different from the rest of the Science Museum's exhibits. It's very old-fashioned. The labels are big chunks of text typed on manual typewriters. There's very little interactivity. So while it's a very special place in the Science Museum, it was also quite anachronistic and incongruous. I've spent a lot of time there, and at times when the Science Museum you could barely move people, there might be 3 or 4 people in this huge space. So it was a natural time for the Science Museum to decommission it and make way for a new exhibition. But partly because of the nature of the gallery and its importance to the Science Museum, when they decommissioned it, they wanted to archive it, but also kind of celebrate it as well, and treat it as something special. So normally they would photograph and video an exhibition before it was decommissioned, but I'd shown them some of the potentials of this technology, and they approached us and asked us, could we scan the entire space, create a 3D record. So we worked with Scanlab, and I recommend you have a look at their website. There's some amazing projects on there. It's a company set up by a couple of ex-UCL architecture students who specialise in terrestrial scanning, and they've worked with artists, architects, they've worked with the BBC and Channel 4 in the UK, they've worked with Greenpeace, scanning ice flows, measuring climate change. So at the time, this was their biggest project. I think it probably still is the biggest single project they've undertaken. So the actual scanning process. So the first night we surveyed the space, initial control survey to establish certain points accurately measured in space. And while for the output that we were commissioned to provide for the Science Museum, which was a video, accuracy wasn't the main consideration. Having this control survey and these accurately measured points, the length of the gallery, it made tying all the individual scans together easier, but also if the data, if our scan was later to be repurposed, it gives us a certain confidence that we've measured the space accurately, and gives us a certain metric so that we could, if for example, they wanted to use the scan for building information management, we can say this is accurate within a certain degree. We also placed a couple of 100 checkerboard targets, just paper targets, I think you can see here, around the gallery, so they would be visible from many of the scan locations, again, just to help us tie the individual scans together. And we used magnetic spheres that were moved between clusters of scans, again, just to help with the registration process and tying everything together. So we scanned the gallery with 2 Faro Photon 120 terrestrial laser scanners. They have a range of maximum range of 120 metres. They can capture 1 million points per second and measure to within plus or minus 2 millimetres at a range of 25 metres. So really impressive bits of kit. To get obviously the laser scan just provides a point cloud, a colourless point cloud with just XYZ information. To get the colour, it's a fairly simple process. You attach just a standard DSLR camera to the top of the scanner, wind the tripod down so that the camera's optical centre is aligned with the laser output, and it takes a series of photos, stitches into a panorama and projects that panoramic colour image onto the point clouds to give RGB information for each point. So the entire space took 275 individual scans and 5 nights in total. So including the control survey, that was working from pretty much when the museum shut at night, so starting about 8 PM till 6 in the morning, over 5 nights. So fairly intensive process and fairly time consuming to capture a space that size, but compared to the capturing process, the processing was an order of magnitude more time. So we captured 2 billion points overall, which adds up to 256 gigs of data, though that's in the kind of compressed proprietary format. To provide that in an interoperable ASCII format, closer to 1 terabyte of data. So there's issues certainly with transferring that. And the entire processing time, 16 weeks, so 16 man weeks, so one person working full-time on this project for 16 weeks. So obviously compared to the 5 nights of capturing, that's vanishingly small in the entire project time. So the processing was first aligning the 275 individual scans with each other and overall with the control survey. Very noisy data. The majority of the exhibits were in glass cases, and when we started the project, we didn't know how the scanners would cope with all the glass cases. In fact, it wasn't as big a problem as we expected, though the reflections, especially when the laser hits the glass at an oblique angle, you do get a lot of noise, reflections, and false points. All had to be cleaned, all the 275 scans, all had to be cleaned by hand, and colour correcting the scans as well. So we did colour correction with colour checkboards, X-Rite colour checkerboards, but for some of the scans, at the beginning and end, but the colour balancing in between was just a subjective process by hand, just to make sure there weren't obvious colour discontinuities between the aligned scans. So the output that was required by the Science Museum was a video, so non-interactive output, a 7-minute video. The video actually only used about 10% of the recorded data, just because of the size of the data. So for the walls, ceiling, floor, throughout 95%, I used about 5-6% of the data for the uninteresting areas, and for the actual objects and the areas of interest, probably about between 17 and 20% of the data. And even then, the 7-minute video produced, and it was all done in point tools. It took 48 hours just to render that 7-minute video, using quite reasonably powerful technology. So just as a note, this was a project done commercially between Scanlab and the Science Museum. But I think as far as Scanlab were concerned, it was kind of a loss leader. It was a new area, museums to enter into. And I don't think anything, certainly of this scale, had really been attempted before. So it was an interesting project for them. But I think you can see from some of these figures just the amount of time taken. It's not a cheap thing to do. It's not certainly Scanlab did this certainly not a profit-making project. So this is just an image of the entire scan data, and I think you maybe get a sense of the scale. So each of these cabinets is about a 5 or 6 foot glass cabinet. There's a 2-story superstructure through the middle. So I think you can get some idea of the scale. Hopefully, if I'll show you the video in a minute, some idea of the scale of the entire project. Some of the objects identified by the Science Museum, by the curator, the important objects within the gallery, were scanned they were treated separately. So as well as scanning the entire space, some of the objects were scanned in more detail and then rendered, using much more of the data, rendered in these isolated renderings to provide a bit more detail for the important objects. So before I talk about the video, so I'll show it. The data, the Science Museum just wanted this video and the data set as an archive, but the data set is there and it's available for anyone that wants to use it, and it could be used, it could be repurposed, as I mentioned earlier. So for future exhibition planning, we have an incredibly accurate model of the gallery space, which in the future, if they wanted to use that for planning future exhibitions, could certainly be done. And also by the building management team for BIM applications. The data set can be repurposed in a variety of different ways. And as the technology improves, the size of the data set and rendering point clouds online is quite tricky. But I know Scanlab worked with an Australian company called Euclidean to actually generate an interactive point cloud that you could walk through just using your browser. And I had to play with that, and it's getting there. The technology I don't think is quite there yet, but Amazon at the moment are working with a portion of the data to create an iPad app, so you can walk through the current exhibition and hold your iPad up and see, using this data set, see what it would have looked like with the old exhibition. Again, they're working on, they're experimenting with it, but as I say, the data set is there. If anyone wants to take a sample or the whole thing to experiment with, to try new applications, you can contact me or Scanlab. My email address is on the first slide. So back to the video. Now, I think he mentioned the video is a fantastic thing. It has a certain aesthetic, point cloud aesthetic, which is, it's not, it's a different way of looking at things. It has a very translucent kind of ethereal effect. And I know it was mentioned in the keynote that we're looking for emotional response, emotional connections. And the video is kind of one piece of the package, but it's got, once it had music, so especially composed music for the video added, and especially commentary by the exhibition's curator. And putting those together, so the technology of the 3D scan, plus the emotive narration, really I think it's more than the sum of its parts. And I'll hope, if we've got time, I'll show you at least some of the video later. But just for the last word for the Science Museum, I mean, this was their aim, to prolong the legacy of this important exhibition, create a record that can be placed online and interacted with a vast public audience, both sort of geographically and temporally. I mean, it's there, it's on the website to be viewed. And some of the initial research I've done is the reaction has been incredibly positive. I'll just say one quote. I uploaded the video to one forum, and someone replied, they just said, "Oh, I watched this video, I was watching at home, and I just stood up and applauded." And I think that's the kind of reaction we're looking for. So I'll play the video, and then if there's any questions, we have time for questions?
Yes, we have some time for some questions while the video runs. Is there audio on it, or is it just...
There is. I'll keep the audio low, just so it doesn't interrupt questions.
My name's David Rooney. I'm the Science Museum's Curator of Transport. The Shippen Galleries opened at the Science Museum in 1963. It's the biggest gallery space in the museum, and it was stuffed full. Over 1,000 absolutely remarkable exhibits. Genuinely historic stuff. Every time I walked through, I found something I'd never seen before. After half a century, though, it was time to close the doors. It was
scans, attach them to the display cabinets or wherever, and then you can use those. The software can recognise those spheres, and you just use those to register those scans together. And then when you move from another cluster, you can just take the spheres and attach them.
So they're magnetic, just so that...
Just so you can attach them,
okay.
They'll stay in the same place, and then yes, you can move them to the next location.
Thank you.
So they work with the, and you can see on here, a lot of these checkerboard targets quite high up, so they're visible from lots of scans. So with those and the spheres, it just helps the registration process.
Question, Liz?
So do you think that you would reuse this in a lot of different ways? So this is a very high-res, full-color, fly-through. Do you think that the museum can reuse this to also have lower-end ones that could be used by the public or downloaded and manipulated and played with and things like that?
I mean, that's the dream would be to have this fully interactive walk-through gallery that visitors come in and walk through. But I think there's, you can see here, it's terrestrial laser scanning, so it provides a certain level of detail. And there's this, as I say, this is kind of rendered with a very point cloud aesthetic, so it's very translucent.
I like that.
It's point, yeah, and it's again with the music and with the narration, and because this is kind of ghostly is the word I'd use. It's kind of an elegiac feel. It's a memorial for this exhibition. It fits really well. But there's other ways of rendering it, for the splats with bigger points, so it's more solid. But it doesn't. I don't think it really. Close inspection, if you let the user walk right up to things and really look at them closely, the resolution possibly isn't good enough for that sort of application.
My husband's going to walk up and pick it up.
Yeah, you walk up and it's very complicated. These boat models, a lot of them have rigging and things, and it doesn't capture brilliantly. So I think this method works brilliantly for this kind of non-interactive video. I think if you want a really interactive thing that you let the user come up and examine closely, maybe different technology, or a combination of different technologies to create something like that.
Thank you. And,
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about, I actually am no longer with the Art Institute of Chicago, but I worked on a project with them, or I led a project there that was funded by the IMLS on Museum 3D, and so that's what I'm going to do my case study on here. At the Art Institute, we have been playing around with 3D in different areas for about a couple years, 2 or 3 years now. And it really started out by us doing some pop-ups and just seeing, putting these in the education center, seeing, pulling people in, unscheduled things, just trying things out. And this was a great way to start because it kind of introduced us to the questions that we had. We've also experimented with conservation and other issues, but I'm going to kind of dig into how we used this in public programs. But I'm happy to talk about some other experiments we've done as well. So based on us just trying it out in the museum, it kind of trying out doing like scanning in the galleries, printing art objects, it really started introducing questions of how can this affect the museum experience? And so we wrote a grant for the IMLS to just really actually dig into this and think about it as a research issue, so that we can make assumptions, but why not dig into those assumptions and see how we can build documentation that could help all of you or any educator that wanted to use a museum collection with 3D printing. So I bring this up here. So we got the IMLS Sparks grant, which is an innovation grant. It's 1 year. It's a great thing to look into because they fund it 1 year. It's not a big grant, but you can get started right away. And we structured it so that basically we could also use this as a capacity building tool within the museum. So we built the way it was structured is we planned for six programs throughout the year. 5 with different audiences. So a family drop-in, a teen lab that ran for 10 weeks, but then we inserted 3D within part of that. A tween camp, which is a 1-week summer camp that investigated 3D scanning and printing within the museum. An educator seminar, which actually looked at it more from a designy way, but that was a 3-day professional development for educators. Adult accessibility tour, so that we were actually looking at it from the standpoint of creating objects and then having touchable objects in the gallery on tour for low-sighted and Alzheimer's affected individuals, and then a capstone event. And the other thing about kind of capacity building and really learning from this is that we structured it so that we had built an advisory team from across the museum. So people from digital media, from audiovisual media, and a large component from the education department were involved in that. And this way we had monthly meetings with this advisory team so that we could help each other build each program and then afterwards talk about it. This also served as an opportunity for, we would have guest speakers at the beginning of each of these, each of these sessions, so we could be inspired by what Donna and Dean is doing at the Met or by what they're doing at the Year of 3D that they did at the Science Museum in London. So this was a really successful component because by the end, people were talking about the project as it was their own because we were all working on it as a collaborative team. It wasn't owned by one person. We were all kind of working on it together. So highly recommended. So the way that because this was really a research project, we wanted to come out at the end with real tools that educators could use, that museum educators could use, is we wanted to have these programs but really evaluate them. So we paid, as part of we had a paid evaluator, a consultant throughout the whole year, Ellery Rosner. She was fantastic. And she worked with the advisory team so that we could develop, dig down into what are the things we're really trying to find out, because it's not easy when you're doing it with 6 distinct programs with distinct audiences. So we had very broad questions. So the primary research question was, in what ways does the use of 3D scanning, printing, and education programming impact visitor engagement with the AIC collection? And then all of the evaluation kind of devices that we built kind of would look at this for each of those programs. Then 2 supporting questions. How do the program characteristics affect, because they were all different, very different programs, affect the impact of 3D technology on visitor engagement? The picture on the side here is actually from our family programs drop-in, and it's probably the cutest thing in the world too. So one of the things in the drop-in, because there were 600 people affected, the 600 people were part of the drop-in. You had to have quick things. It is a very low impact because they come in, they go. It's really crazy. It's just, if any of you have been part of a family day, whew, wow, they're exhausting. So this was something where we were saying, pose like a statue. We had pictures of statues around, and then we'd send them to galleries, but then they would make their own statue, which actually looks like one of our monkey statues. This is pretty cute. So the second supporting question was, how does exposure to 3D impact audience and understanding and perception of the art collection and art objects and art making? So how does this impact? And so a lot of this, and I won't get into how we did the evaluation, but I'd be happy to get into that. And I'm in the middle of, we're writing a paper about it for the IMLS so that we could share it with the rest of the world. So, so each one of these, this kind of guided how we were evaluating each one. So I'm going to just jump into the very, very top level learnings that we got to. And one of the most exciting programs, I think, in the end for me. They were all fantastic, but I have to say that one of the more emotional ones was really the program where we did make 3D replicas, 1-to-1 size of the of artworks in the gallery, and we focused on artworks that were meant to be touched back when they were actually objects in the world and not behind vitrines. And this was the impact that we had here, because these were tour groups that were coming to the museum that were low-sighted or blind, but they were still coming to the museum for tours. So, there was that desire for this experience, but here, and they would listen to the descriptions from the facilitator tour guide, the educator, and then in this case, this would get handed around. We had about 4 objects that were a 1-to-1 size. And it really, the impact that it had was the people on the tour would say, I could see the work for the first time. And in the interview phase, one of the people said to the other person, no, you don't mean see. And she said, this blind person said, yes, no, I meant I can see it for the first time. So, that's a really big deal. So the top level finding is that getting through the glass is really powerful and possible, that these multisensory experiences, and we actually put some sound in here as well. The fact that things were replicas didn't seem to matter. The fact that things were of a different substance. And so we tried to drill into that a little bit. And the interesting part is that, we in museums seem to think that that replicas, I think we put replicas way down lower, and we had statements such as, I'd rather have a replica of something really fantastic, of a masterpiece, than have the real thing of something that's junk. Or we'd get these exciting factors of, like, someone would say, I got to touch a replica of blah, blah, blah. It's just really interesting. So you really get into whole other strains that you could dig into. But definitely something even, that people actually appreciate that. And I think we definitely, or the Art Institute is definitely going to be using those on regular tours as well. And it would be interesting to actually see if the reaction is the same. So another top level thing that came out of this is that encounters with 3D printed objects provoked critical thinking about art. That's a big statement to say here, but I put a picture here from the Teen Lab, which was, again, inserted into a larger program, so that in a 10-week where they were meeting 3 days a week, it's After School Matters. This is a picture. They had an exhibition at the end, and this is one fellow who, Deshaun Gaston, who got really into the 3D printing and 3D scanning. So that's him, and then he had some glitches in there, and then he enhanced the glitches, and he did some other 3D printing. But then he got into doing something with alabaster. And so his title on this is New Art versus Old Art 2014. I love how he made a label for it and everything. So I think and he was talking about how crazy and difficult it was to make that, and difficult to make the 3D. So this is just one example. Obviously, these top level are based on a lot of different research, but just a thing. So both making and viewing generate discussions about art making, and artistry. That's what we found. We didn't find only great things. There were difficult issues, which you might imagine. Experimental programming requires specific infrastructure. Collaboration and flexibility are essential. I think this comes out a lot at this conference, but in putting on these programs, there were a lot of assumptions that, well, of course, didn't you know that the 3D printers were going to be needed on this day, but they weren't, or something like that, or just, having different people understand the programs, different people understand the hardware, who's going to be around on that Saturday, and so just really being able to communicate, wanting, especially with the teen program, it was a very teen-driven program, and so there was a difficulty in that they wanted to be flexible, but we needed to know when those 40 computers needed a certain software. So, so this is just something that we'll dig into more in the paper, but that you really need to kind of set up these things in advance so it's very fluid. There's a lot of trust, a lot of communication between all the different teams that have access to the hardware, know the software, and that. So tricky. And then the final big finding that we found, which I think is really, that was very significant factor, is that facilitation was absolutely key to how much impact these programs had, or how much they could make connections back to the collection. So in the case where where a visitor or a participant had access or was in contact with an educator or a technologist or someone that we were kind of trying to help them make the connections, it was vastly better. And so this also means that the staffing level for these programs, the staffing level was very high. So for the tween week-long program, it was basically almost a one-to-one kind of person to the thing. So we matter. That's a good thing, actually. So because it really means that we can help shape the. It's still a participatory. It's a peer-to-peer. It's learning all the thing, but it really helps to have a lot of people around and on board to help make the connections and help kind of make sure that no one gets lost along the way. So it was really a key to someone just coming in and leaving right away. And some of these programs, I'll say that the educator program, it was such a different way for educators to think, to dive in and start trying and experimenting things. At least that was our experience. And so the first day, they were actually crying. And we had one person drop out just because it was so much more open-ended and it was the learning curve. But by the end, the people who stuck with it seemed to kind of also be not only get to the point where they felt comfortable with the technology, but the bonding, to get to do kind of this creative work was, it seemed the program got really good reviews in the end. So I just pulled out a couple quotes. There's nothing like standing in front of the original art, but the copies make it possible for people who can't see the original. Sometimes the relationship with the copy can be better than with the original. That's one of the educators' comments. And one of the low-sighted tour comments was, maybe I'm not an artist or artistically inclined, but touching the piece wakes something up inside of you. And I think that that's definitely a particular goal of myself in these programs, is to really see the museum as a point of as a platform for creativity, so people can actually see that they also have an active role in being able to create things themselves. So all in all, successful. We learned a lot. Wasn't all easy, and we'll have more information up in the world, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So.
Okay, I'm Catherine Epp, so I'm the digital media manager at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I'm just going to take you through just a small project that we finished up early in the year about how we're using an in-gallery interactive screen to tell stories about very, very small objects that are part of our permanent collection. So I'm going to run through a whole number of slides here. For those of you who don't know, the Art Gallery of Ontario, it's based in lovely, very cold Toronto, Canada. We were founded in 1900 by a number of private citizens under the name of the Art Museum of Toronto. So it's gone through a couple different names, and the location has expanded. Back in 2008, we went through a huge transformation project with the new architectural design with the lovely and great Frank Gehry. So our physical space is probably about 583,000 square feet. Visitors, we have over 600 visitors a year, and over about 50% of them are from the Greater Toronto area. So it's very much a local Toronto destination, as well as a very Canadian destination for us. And we're mostly, about 40% were funded by the different levels of government. In terms of our collection, the AGO is home to about 80,000 works. Our Canadian collection, most notably the Thompson collection, is probably our most coveted. So back in 2002, art collector Ken Thompson, he gifted a very important gift of about 2,000 works to the AGO, and I think the worth is somewhere like $130 million. It includes 300 works from the names of the Group of Seven and Tom Thompson, over 130 mainly British ship models, and 900 European objects. The cornerstone is perhaps actually the 17th century masterpiece by Peter Paul Rubens, the Mask of the Innocents. The collection itself, it spans about 30 gallery spaces in our in our gallery over the 3 levels of the AGO. So it's fairly large there. And what I'm going to talk about the project is actually about in terms of the Thompson European collection. We had built this sort of introductory space, which was the entry point to introduce the visitors to the actual European collection. That space has 2 paintings, a ship model, as well as a display, a vitrine of miniature objects surrounded all by glass. So this vitrine allows the visitors to get a really kind of a close-up look at these miniature objects, really kind of look in there and see what they're all about. When we had the space, our visitors were really telling us that, hey, it's great, love it, love looking at these, but they really wanted to learn a little bit more about the objects and a little bit more about the collector and why he collected it, what it meant to him. So we then explored, we need a way to deepen this experience so that they can appreciate the object and tell the story about all these particular objects. And a secondary objective was really to provide a wayfinding method that would link the objects that are in this particular vitrine display to other, the entire collection throughout the rest of the gallery. So this here is actually a picture of one side of the particular display case. These are extraordinary objects that were collected by Ken Thompson, and it actually represents just a small sample of the collection as a whole. It's a varied collection. There's things in there from silver, enamel, boxwood. There's carved portraits, medallions, and just a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Now, there's one of the things that we did want is people to really look at these. I want to point to some of them. There's so much things in there, and some of these are very small. I mean, they're the size of maybe like your pinky or your thumbs, and they're just way too small. So we'll have people looking and trying to grasp and view these. So we needed a solution to really bring these objects to life. So we decided to go digital here and bring in a screen. We landed on a 55-inch screen. I mean, we didn't go any larger, mainly because the aesthetics of this particular space was very, very important. Anita had a very, very minimalist design. No wire showing, there's hardly any labels around a lot of the Thompson spaces, and we really wanted to respect that. If we had gone larger, what we would have found that it might draw people to the screen, which would be great, but they're not actually viewing the objects for that piece. All right. So I had originally planned maybe I'd do an actual live demo, but since this is running on their internal networks, it was really hard to kind of repurpose it back here. So old school method, screenshots. So this is a starting screen of the interactive. Really is just to introduce the visitor to Ken Thompson, a little bit about him, why he collected and appreciated a lot of these fine materials. He was fascinated with the sculptures as well as details and miniature objects. All right. So to bring the user in, they would tap Get Started. I'm going to go through some of these kind of quickly. And then it would display the particular vitrine case for them. We've activated about 12 different touch points here, and by tapping on these, they'll be able to activate the particular screen and get into the more details about specific objects. All right. As long as we don't move anything in the vitrine case, this will still be good. All right. So the next screen here, this is just one of the sample details. This is actually the Shepperton bust that Thompson collected. And actually, well, a lot of the information on it is the very typical tombstone data, as well as any extended label data that we have in everything that, all our objects within the gallery. These particular 2 busts were actually what started Thompson's lifetime of collecting. So he was really fascinated by these. The actual size of the busts are probably about 3 inches high, and they're replicas of life-size ones that were created. So he was really fascinated with these. What isn't visible on this particular screenshot here is that the user can swipe left to right to view multiple views of all the objects that have been activated, as well as they can pinch and zoom and actually get into the fine details and take a much closer look at these. What our next stage, what we did incorporate in the first phase of our project was to actually do the 3D rendering. And that was because we did run into some technical issues about how do we, getting the 3D scan at a level of depth and details, considering some of these objects were so tiny. So it is part of our next phase there. At the very bottom, we do have what is a button. It's called Find Related Objects. This is where when a user taps on it, it will tell them about this particular object and how it relates to the entire Cheverton collection. So if they were to tap on it, we get presented a floor plan. This is actually the first floor of the AGO, and it will indicate to the visitor where the rest of the Cheverton collection is. So there's a huge gallery, just yet another case in display of tons and tons of these miniature collections, miniature busts. This one here, I just wanted to show it because it's actually one of my favorites in the case. Every time I take a look at it, there's something new that I find. And this is the Peach Pit portrait of King Charles I. For anyone who's not familiar with this, so this is actually a peach pit in which someone had carved the portrait of King Charles I onto it. And then they painted it and then mounted it in rock crystal into this pendant. And then on the flip side of the pendant, because you can't swipe left to right to flip this, is actually the King Charles I's the coat of arms. So it's a very fascinating story of this particular pendant. It is probably the size of my thumbnail, the reality of this. The artist is listed as Nicholas Briot here. There's some further research that really sort of indicated that it wasn't his work. Nicholas Briot was known to do carved medallions, but some further later research suggested that this was some anonymous work. So there's a whole story behind this, and Thompson was very drawn into this, these particular objects and just the exquisiteness of some of these. So I wanted to share that because that's my personal favorite. Okay. And one of the issues that we did encounter is that because some of these objects are as small as they are, is getting the level of detail that we want and the depth. So our photographers had to essentially reshoot all of these objects that we wanted for the interactive, and using focal stacking software to really bring that object to life at that level. So the picture on the left is using a standard long-range macro lens, and you can see there's a little bit of fuzziness as you move away from the center cherub there. And the one on the right is retaken using focus stacking and then applying the software to it. So you can see that there's much more of an extended depth of field and details. This is a folding knife made with a boxwood handle. It's probably about 1.5 inches long. So that's one of the things that we have to do for all the 15 objects. So very labor-intensive task there. Just to quickly go through just a few of the tools that we had used as the team. It was a very, very collaborative effort with our photographers, our interactive designer. This was all done in-house by our HO team over the course of 3 months, so they really ramped up and worked hard on this. Some notable ones is Helicon Soft is the software we used for the photo stacking. Nicely run Adobe suite of products that we do enjoy. Our phase 1 cameras, the Microsoft screen, as well as some Google Analytics. So, what's our takeaways? Start early in terms of development photography. We always love lots of time to do projects. Unfortunately, sometimes we do get into that little crunch. So we had taken away the 3D scanning as part of that. We don't have a 3D scanner, that's one of the problems. So with next door to us, we do have an art and design college and university. They actually had a 3D scanner, so we had intentions of using this. But what we're finding is that because some of these objects were so tiny, the scanner didn't work well with some shiny objects, some wooden objects, and anything that had hair. So when we're scanning things like the Peach Pit pendant, you're just not getting that detail that you want. Right? Visitor research and feedback is always valuable. We do some formal research on exit surveys, and we do some informal ones where some of us sometimes when we're walking, we're actually watching users as they're using this interactive. And one of the things that we did have to change was that the font, it needed a little bit more contrast, so we had corrected that. As well, we're finding that some of our users, our visitors, we do skew a little older. Our visitors tend to range about 50 and up, and some of them were dwelling a lot longer than the application allows you. So if you were standing there reading for about 3 minutes and you had not touched the screen would refresh after that idle. So those are things that as we're watching, we are learning. And we're setting up metrics, and because we do want to measure and make informed decisions. All right. What's next for us? Keep on growing, increasing the touch points, getting back to 3D rendering, data. Visitor research feedback. Applying learnings for our new interactives. We've already done that in some of the new interactives that we had developed since this particular one. And we also are expanding on options for technology for small objects. So specifically things like micro CT and actually X-rays. So for some things that we have, there's stories of the objects inside the particular object that we can't see. So we have done a few where we're looking at just X-rays and micro CTs just to see what's inside some of these objects. So it's not specific to this particular project, but for one of our other ones, just to tell those stories. And that's it. Thank you.